often tell my grandchildren that life has a way of teaching you lessons you never asked for. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and the story I am about to tell you is one I never imagined sharing with anyone outside my heart. It is the story of betrayal, heartbreak, and eventually, a sweet revenge that only patience and careful planning could bring. I remember the day my late husband, Thomas, and I had finalized our will as if it happened yesterday. Thomas was a man of precision, a man who valued integrity above all else. We had built a life together, raising two sons, Richard and James, in a sprawling house in Surrey. On paper, it was the perfect family, loving, prosperous, and genteel. But beneath the smiles, something had quietly been eroding. As they grew, Richard and James were charming, clever, and ambitious. Yet, ambition can be a double-edged sword, and theirs had become a blade pointed at me. I had watched them, over the years, slip further into entitlement, speaking of wealth as though it were owed to them for merely existing. I tried to guide them, to teach them the values my mother had instilled in me, but the lessons never took root. The tension reached its peak one crisp autumn morning when I received a summons. The will was to be read publicly, and all beneficiaries were expected to attend. I prepared myself, not with fear, but with a quiet resolve. I had spent years preparing, carefully documenting not only my estate, but also subtle accounts of their behavior. Letters, financial records, and even small incidents that revealed their true character. Everything was neatly compiled in a folder I carried with me, hidden in plain sight, as if it were just another piece of paperwork. When I arrived at the reading, I was met with the kind of cold calculation that only children who see their parents as obstacles can produce. Richard and James, in all their pomp and self-assurance, blocked my seat as if I were an intruder in my own life. I looked at them, my heart tightening, and heard Richard say with a smirk, "You're not mentioned here." James nodded, his eyes flashing with a mix of arrogance and impatience. I felt the sting of betrayal, sharper than any physical pain I had ever known. They had assumed that because I was their mother, I would be powerless in the face of greed, that my influence had ended with the final stroke of the pen on my husband's will. But they underestimated me. I calmly pulled out the folder I had carried, the weight of it solid in my hands, and felt a quiet thrill. It was not a folder of mere papers. It was a culmination of years of observation, preparation, and yes, quiet revenge. As I opened it, the room seemed to shift. The air was thick with expectation and arrogance. I could see the glimmer of curiosity in their eyes, the unspoken thought that perhaps I had made a mistake in my final arrangements. That tiny flicker of uncertainty was the first crack in the armor of their self-confidence. In that moment, I recalled the many nights I had spent in quiet reflection, thinking about the men my sons were becoming and the consequences they might face if left unchecked. My heart ached with disappointment, yet it also beat with determination. I had endured their selfishness for years, silently observing, always planning, always waiting for the right moment. And now here it was, the stage set for my reckoning. As my sons leaned forward, expecting a simple dismissal, I felt a surge of calm power. This was not just about inheritance. This was about justice. This was about showing them, finally, that while wealth can be inherited, respect, love, and honor cannot, and that betrayal has its consequences. I took a deep breath, and with a smile that hid both sorrow and resolve, I began to speak. The folder in my hands was more than paper. It was a mirror, reflecting every choice, every deception, and every act of greed my sons had committed. And they were about to see themselves as I had seen them, stripped of pretense and confronted with the truth. The folder sat on my lap like a small, unassuming talisman. Yet I knew it held more power than any sword or gavel ever could. My sons Richard and James leaned forward, their smug expressions wavering just enough to give away the flicker of doubt I had been waiting for. They thought this was another ordinary will reading, another formality to endure before pocketing their inheritance. They had no idea that the real story, the truth of their actions, and my carefully orchestrated reckoning, was about to unfold. I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. The first thing I pulled out was a letter I had written years ago but never sent. It was addressed to Richard, in which I had praised him for a small act of kindness that had long since been forgotten. But in the same letter, I subtly noted moments of cruelty, selfishness, and disregard for others. The contrast was sharp, almost surgical, and it was designed to make him squirm when he realized that I had remembered every slight. James's eyes flickered nervously as I read aloud from a ledger that detailed transactions they had made in my name. Loans taken from family friends under the guise of business investments, money that never returned to the household, and lavish purchases meant solely to impress colleagues and neighbors. They had assumed that because I was their mother, I would never confront them, never reveal the extent of their manipulation. But here it was, all laid bare, black on white, undeniable. I watched as Richard shifted in his seat, a flush creeping up his neck, and James's jaw tightened. For a moment, I allowed myself a pang of sadness. This wasn't merely about wealth, but about the children I had loved so deeply and who had chosen selfishness over loyalty. Yet, there was also a thrill, an undeniable satisfaction, in seeing the first cracks appear in their armor. Next, I revealed a series of photographs, small, intimate snapshots from their childhood. In some, Richard had broken a neighbor's window, and I had quietly covered for him. In others, James had lied to me about small misdeeds, assuming they would never be noticed. Each photo had a note beside it, recounting the incident, the lesson, and the consequence, or lack thereof. My sons' faces paled as they realized that I had catalogued years of behavior, every slight, every lie, every moment of thoughtless ambition. I was not only holding them accountable for their actions, I was holding up a mirror, and they did not like what they saw. Then came the final piece, a set of letters from people they had wronged. Friends, colleagues, and distant relatives who had suffered because of their selfishness and deceit. I had collected these letters over the years, not out of malice, but to protect myself and perhaps subconsciously, to prepare for this very moment. As I read excerpts aloud, the room grew tense. Their faces twisted with disbelief, anger, and the dawning realization that I had been watching them all along. You never thought I would notice, I said softly, more to myself than to them. But I did. Every word, every act, every betrayal, it has all been noted. Richard's hands clenched into fists. Mother, you can't do this. This is insane, he stammered, voice cracking as if he suddenly realized the gravity of what was happening. I smiled gently, the calm before the storm. Insane? Perhaps. But it is just. And justice, I said, tapping the folder, requires patience and care. Two things you never learned. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. I could feel their desperation, the way their eyes darted to each other, seeking support or a way out. But there was none. This was my moment, years in the making. They had underestimated me, believing that my love for them would blind me to their faults. But love is not blind. It sees, it remembers, and when necessary, it corrects. As I closed the folder, I sensed the final shift. Their arrogance had been replaced with uncertainty, their certainty replaced with fear. And in that fear, I found not just satisfaction, but power. The power to reveal that their inheritance, their pride, and their assumptions about me would not go unchallenged. The stage was set for the next act, where patience would give way to consequences, and betrayal would meet its reckoning. The moment I had been waiting for had arrived. Richard and James sat before me, their faces a mixture of disbelief, panic, and most infuriatingly arrogance. They had assumed that my role in this room was passive, that I would sit quietly and accept the slights, the betrayals, and the years of entitlement. How wrong they were. I placed the folder on the table, but this time, I didn't touch it again. Its contents had done their work, showing them their greed, their lies, their carelessness. Now it was time for action, for the final act in a play they never realized they were part of. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. It was simple, unassuming, yet it held the key to my carefully orchestrated justice. This, I said, my voice steady and calm, contains the final instructions for my estate. Everything you believe is yours is not. Richard's eyes narrowed. Mother, this is ridiculous. You can't do this. We are your sons. James leaned forward, voice trembling, though he tried to mask it with anger. You promised. I held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I promised nothing. You promised yourselves everything. But promises are not the same as rights. Rights are earned. And you, my dear boys, have squandered every shred of trust and respect I ever gave you. I opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, and read aloud the key clauses I had secretly inserted into my final will. The estate, I explained, was not going to be divided among them. Instead, the bulk of it would go to causes they had mocked, charities they had derided, and individuals they had harmed. There was a small provision for distant cousins, people I knew would manage the funds responsibly. As I read, I could see the color drain from their faces. Richard's hands trembled. "Mother, this is illegal. You can't do this." I smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and triumph. "Oh, but it is perfectly legal. You see, I consulted a lawyer, someone I trust implicitly, Margaret Hensley. Every word, every clause, every loophole you thought you could exploit was accounted for. You believed you were clever. You were merely careless." James leaned back, disbelief etched into every line of his face. All those years you planned this?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I watched. I listened. I recorded. I remembered. And now, finally, you are seeing the consequences of your choices." I could feel the weight of my years, the strength of a lifetime of observation, settling over the room. This was not about money alone. It was about justice, about correcting the imbalance that had been created by their greed and their betrayal. I allowed myself a brief smile, not of cruelty, but of quiet satisfaction. Then, just to make the lesson complete, I added one more twist. The family home, the estate itself, would not go to them either. Instead, it would be sold, and the proceeds distributed to causes dear to me: education, healthcare, and programs for disadvantaged children. Richard and James would leave the room with nothing, except the bitter memory of underestimating the one person they had always assumed would be powerless: me. The room fell silent. Their anger and frustration were palpable, but so too was the realization that nothing could undo what had been done. I could see the weight of regret beginning to settle over them, though it was too late to salvage anything. As they stood, I addressed them one final time. "This is what happens when love is taken for granted, when respect is disregarded. Remember this, not just for yourselves, but for the lives you touch in the future. Betrayal may go unnoticed for a while, but eventually, justice has its way." They left without a word, their pride shattered, their assumptions destroyed. And as the door closed behind them, I felt a calm, profound satisfaction. Not just at the cleverness of my plan, but at the knowledge that at last the betrayal had been met with its reckoning. I took a deep breath and leaned back in my chair. My revenge was complete, but more importantly, it was just. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes patience, observation, and a carefully prepared folder can achieve what anger and confrontation never could. Years have passed since that day, and yet I can recall it with perfect clarity, as if it happened yesterday. I often tell my grandchildren, Sophie and Oliver, about it, not as a tale of malice or triumph, but as a lesson in patience, justice, and the quiet power of wisdom. Life, I have learned, is less about vengeance and more about understanding, and about leaving a legacy that teaches without uttering a single scolding word. After Richard and James stormed out that day, the house settled into a profound silence. The walls, once crowded with the echoes of ambition and entitlement, seemed to breathe relief. I remember walking through the empty halls, touching the surfaces that had been witness to so many years of memory. Some joyful, some painful, and thinking of my late husband, Thomas. He had always believed that justice was not a momentary satisfaction, but a principle that endured. That day, I felt his presence beside me, approving, calm, and wise. Over time, the consequences of my decisions became evident. My sons, who had expected wealth to carry them through life, were left to face the realities of their own choices. Richard, once so confident and demanding, struggled with debts and decisions he could no longer evade. James, who had always relied on charm to manipulate situations, found himself isolated and confronted with the truth of his own recklessness. I do not tell this to gloat. Their suffering was a reflection of their own decisions, not my cruelty. Life has a way of teaching harsh lessons when one refuses to listen. For me, the aftermath brought a quiet, profound satisfaction. Not merely because my revenge had been effective, but because it was fair, deliberate, and guided by reason rather than anger. I realized then that true power lies not in force or intimidation, but in foresight, in the patience to prepare, and in the courage to act when the moment is right. The folder that had caused them such fear was more than paper and ink. It was a testament to observation, memory, and integrity. In sharing this story with Sophie and Oliver, I emphasize more than the cunning or the clever twists of fate. I emphasize values, respect for others, the importance of honesty, and the consequences of taking love for granted. I show them the folder, not its contents, for some things are better left private, but the principle it represents, that one must be mindful of actions and their impact, and that justice, when guided by reason, can restore balance in unexpected ways. The grandchildren, wide-eyed and curious, often ask if I ever felt sadness watching their ungrateful behavior unfold. And I do not hide it. I felt a deep ache in my heart. After all, they were my children, the ones I had nurtured and loved. But love does not excuse wrongdoing, and it does not blind one to reality. It can guide, teach, and ultimately shape the way justice is carried out. That is the legacy I wish to leave. Not only material wealth, but wisdom, clarity, and understanding of human nature. As the evening sun filters through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, now managed according to the charitable wishes I set forth, I often sit in the quiet and reflect. The house is no longer a stage for entitlement and greed. It has become a sanctuary of purpose and meaning. The charities I supported have flourished, and the lives touched by those decisions have brought me more satisfaction than any inheritance ever could. And so when I tell Sophie and Oliver this story, I tell it with both sadness and joy, for it is a tale of betrayal, but also of triumph. Triumph not of ego, but of principle. I want them to remember that life rewards patience, integrity, and wisdom. I want them to know that while betrayal may wound deeply, it can also teach invaluable lessons, and that even in the darkest moments, one can create justice that is fair, precise, and enduring. I close my eyes, feeling the weight of years behind me and the promise of the future ahead. The folder has done its work, the lesson has been learned, and I am at peace. Justice has its day, and in the quiet of reflection, I smile, not at revenge, but at the enduring power of foresight, love, and careful thought. That, I tell my grandchildren, is the truest legacy anyone can leave.